Okay. You can go on to the next screen, the next slide. Thank you. This is the print that is part of the show in Albuquerque at the gallery. It's called One Deep Roar. It's pretty small. It's 8.5 by 11, and I'm going to talk more about the process that went into making this a little bit later on. But I wanted to thank you all and welcome you for coming tonight and listening to my talk. It's always it's important to be able to share this work with other people. For me, it's not really complete until I've had the chance to show the work to other people and have some sort of a dialogue about it. So thank you for coming and for listening to me talk about my work. The next slide. I'm going to step back in time a little bit before I get into the current work I've been doing during the COVID pandemic. This piece was something that was for the series immediately before the work from COVID-19. And I had started this series after I had gone back to Detroit, where I grew up, and went through the house. We were selling the house I grew up in. It had been in our family for 50 years, and my parents had both died, and my brother owned the house, and he was selling it. So I went back to take photographs of it, to just spend some time there saying goodbye to it, and to just see what there was to see. That seems to be a big theme in most of my processes, see what there is to see without a lot of preconceptions before I start. And when I went back and did these, had that visit and then came back, I created a series of work. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but what it did for me is it started me to thinking about what made a place a home and why did I move to Vermont and live in this rural area, and why did that feel more like home to me than the place where I had actually grown up. So I really spent a lot of time thinking and reading and making work about the experience of place and feeling at home in that place. Next slide. And this is a second slide from that series. And what I did with these pieces, I like to set rules for myself. They really kind of, because I can easily get distracted and spread my energies all over the place because I'm so interested in so many different things. What I did is I set some rules for myself, and I said, okay, for the next year, you are going to spend the time, you're going to spend a little time every day walking around your yard. I live on a small parcel of land, it's less than an acre in a very rural area. And I'm going to spend time each day for a full year, regardless of the weather, just photographing what I see in this walk around my property. And the last slide in this slide, and this next one, if you'll switch to the next slide, please, came about from that experience. And these are quite large. I printed them, the biggest I can print on my printer is 13 by 19. So I wanted these to be much bigger than that. So I printed panels of 13 by 19 inches, and then I sewed them together. These don't show the sewing on them because these are the source images. They're not the completed sewn images, but the sewn images look just like these, only they're in sections. They're sewn together. And they're 20 inches wide and 72 inches long, so they're quite big. Okay, next slide, please. I'd like to read something that meant a lot to me when I was working through this series. It's from Lucy Lepard, Lure of the Local, excuse me. And she wrote, "The lure of the local is not always about home as an expressive place, a place of origin and return. Sometimes it's about the illusion of home as a memory. If place is defined by memory, but no one who remembers it is left to bring these memories to the surface, does a place become no place or only a landscape?" So I was thinking about this. I don't consider myself a landscape photographer, but I'm photographing the land. And for me, this became metaphors for the idea of time passing, new memories being layered over past experiences, to bring you into a present. And I was really compelled to know why a place that I'd only lived 5 years was more home to me than the home in which I grew up in. I really wanted to know what this small piece of earth was about intimately and completely, and to understand how that reflected who I am. Next slide, please. Next slide. These are printed over prints. There's, as you'll see in the next group, I've done some sanding with sandpaper and steel wool between the images as I printed them repeatedly through the printer with different images, but these are just one photograph that I printed, and then I would send that photograph back through my printer and print a second photo on top of it to get this sort of digital collage. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this brings us up to the work that I started during the beginning of the pandemic, when we were all sequestered at home with such an uncertain future, which still seems pretty uncertain. One of the first things I did just to comfort myself is I started cleaning like crazy. And I started cleaning the studio and pulling out all these prints that were not really very good, either technically or aesthetically. I didn't really like them. And being curious about how I could take these prints and experiment with them. I mean, I had nothing to lose. I wasn't going to be showing these to anybody. So I tried a lot of different things. I painted on them, I drew on them, I collaged on them, but everything seemed really forced and nothing really felt true to my interest in how time and memory affect our sense of self. So then I had gone to a show earlier, a few months earlier, where I saw a painter who had used a sander, a hand sander, but like an electric sander, to sand the layers of paint off his canvases. So I thought, well, what if I sanded my photographs? So I went and got some sandpaper and some steel wool, and I just started sanding the pages, these prints. And then after I sanded them, well, one thing I was really surprised about was how deep the inks went into the prints themselves. But I sanded them, cleaned off all the residue, and then I printed a different image on top of the image that I had sanded. Okay, so next slide, please. So I would erode each print, deface them, and then overlay them with other images. And they started to become kind of this mashup of experiences of the past brought into my present. In a more darkly veiled vision of what I felt my life had become during this time of being sequestered at home, with being isolated, with not really knowing when we would be able to resume routines. Next slide, please. And it had always been important to me in my work that the process that I went through in creating the work reflected my intention and my message. And I really felt that by sanding off the surfaces of these prints and overprinting on top of them, really kind of supported the notion of time passing and the extent in which the past is changed by the present. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. As the series grew and the time of isolation and uncertainty continued, and I realized now, looking at the work, it started to get darker and darker. It's really, it never ceases to amaze me about how our unconscious feelings and thoughts and motivations come across in our art. I really wasn't feeling, I was feeling isolated, and I was feeling concerned about the future, but I didn't realize how deeply upset that I was about what was happening until I started to look at these pieces. After I would make them, I would hang them up on the wall in the studio, and I would just spend time with them. I wasn't even consciously looking at them, but the more prints I put on the wall, the more I was overwhelmed with this sense of darkness that was coming through. Next slide. Next slide. I found that I could sand and reprint up to 4 different images onto a single piece of paper before the ink would not absorb into the paper in any way. Next slide. So I was working with all those pictures that I had taken from that year that I spent walking around my yard. And I think it's kind of ironic. Here I was working with images that I had a self-imposed restriction that I made during, I could only make at home during the time when we could go anywhere. And now here we were, we could not leave the house, and we were confined to not traveling anywhere. And I was still working with these pictures that I made during a time when I could have gone anywhere but didn't. It just felt kind of ironic to me. Next slide. And part of what I really loved about this process is it brought back to me some of the mystery that had disappeared with digital photography. That excitement of going into the dark room and developing your film and then making a print and putting the photo paper in the developing trays and seeing that image come to the surface is such a magic feeling. And with digital, there's really none of that. And what I found with this, I couldn't really predict how these final images were going to come about in the end. Now here you'll see the detail on the right of a section so that you can see some of the marks that are made in the print from the sanding. But I could not control these. I could control how much I sanded the prints, but I really couldn't control what the eventual outcome of the image was going to look like. These would all be considered monoprints. I could never make 2 of these the same. Even if I use the same photographs, there's going to be variations in what happens when they're layered because of the sanding and the humidity and all different kinds of environmental factors that affect how the image finally comes to play. Next slide. And here you can see some of the marks. In some of the images, I sanded off just about everything from the source, the first photograph. Others, I sanded certain areas and left more of the original image showing through. For every one of these that I felt happy with and felt successful, there probably were 10 that did not work. Next. 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 These are, the largest of these prints are 17 by 22, and the smallest was 5 by 9. Next. And again, I included a detail here so you can see some of the marks that were left on the surface of the paper by the sanding. Next. And Another observation that I had after living with these prints on the wall for a while is there seems to be this consistency that was unintentional on my part with having this dark area that was a hole receding back into the space. And I see that coming up a lot in the images, and it wasn't intentional, but I think a lot of times these unintentional ideas that we have present themselves in the work. And for me, when I look at them, even though these are dark spaces, they feel like a safe space, an exit space. They don't feel frightening to me, even though they're dark. Next. And these very white, those really white circles are actually almost rips in the paper. I use different types of paper in my printing, and I sanded on all different types of paper just to see what the results would be. And on the thinner papers like this one, it actually abraded the surface far enough down that no ink would then attach itself when I sent it back into the printer. And that brings us up to this second series that I started. If you, the next slide, please. A little different note. I wanted to end by showing you a few slides from a series that I just have started working on. Being the pack rat that I am, for a long time, I have had this box of cards from Crypto Corporation called Understanding Our Feelings. And they are 28 photographs that are aimed at developing understanding of self and others. And they're used with children back in the 60s. They're from 1967. And I've had these cards and I've wanted to do something with them. They're about 8.5 by 11. They're black and white. And as you can see from these two images here on either side of the landscape, showing people in expressing different sorts of emotions. And I thought that right now was the perfect time. I finally understood why I'd been holding on to these cards and what my path forward for them was. If you could go back, thank you. So I scanned the cards, and then I started layering and blending digitally different photographs onto the cards to create these montages, I guess you could call them, of the people. And then I've been starting to pair them with hyper saturated photographs from the area around my house that I had taken. So once again, I'm using the source photographs from that year project where I walked around the yard and photographed what I saw. And I'm working on, I'm not sure exactly where this series is going to go, but this is the point it's at this point. If you could go to the next slide, please. If you'll notice in the tie of this fella, that is not one of my images. I did use a uncopyrighted image of the coronavirus that I found on the internet. But otherwise, the photographs are my own, except for the scans too. And next. And then the last one is next. So thank you for coming and listening to my talk. Be happy to answer any questions.
Oh, I have one.
Sure.
I was wondering what you do with what you call the fail prints from your sanding experiments, if you just discard them or if you try to use them for other projects.
Well, I think you got my number there. I can't throw anything away. So currently I have a stack that's growing, and I'm thinking that somehow I will make them into books. I think that they would make very interesting little books. So No, I have a really hard time throwing anything away.
No, I was hoping that you kept them because that's what I would have done.
Yeah. And I think there's still a possibility. There's some collaging that could happen with some of them.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Michelle, can you make us a coronavirus tie? I think that would be very stylish.
Ah, there you go. Just like the fella in that picture.
Yeah,
I bet I could out of paper. Could it be out of paper?
sure. No, that's really quite striking. I wanted to ask you about that dark spot you've kept finding in your paintings. If the paintings are sort of a sense of the present overlaying the past and making it less distinct, kind of sanded down and covered over by a more recent image so that it changes. Is that dark spot something that exists for you as you feel it as both past and present? Does it have a continuity over time, or is this something that you just would say you find now?
That's a really good question. Are you asking if I've noticed that in my other work, or are you asking some sort of portal in the present work that kind of transports me back and forth to the past and the future?
More the second, yeah. Is that something? No, not something specifically in your past work, but just something you're feeling now as you think about your present and your past. Is there a kind of, does that have some kind of connection for you between the two?
Well, I think that it's about the mystery. Sometimes I get excited about the mystery of the unknown, that what we can't know, because it just feels not frightening. It feels full of possibility. So I think that the black spot's a little bit about that. It's the unknowing. It works both ways. It's unknowing of things that I have not yet realized from my past, as well as the possibilities of what could be in the future. I try to live with that uncertainty. It's not easy. I really like answers, and I really like to know where I'm going, and I like plans, and I like rules, and I like the security of a structure. But I think that I practice living with uncertainty, and that's what those black spaces are kind of about for me, is living with that uncertainty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not an artist, but I'm very curious about your process, because I know that some artists use their art to express themselves. You seem to have sort of a different relationship in terms of having your materials, having materials or processes that you discover reveal themselves in ways that now make meaning to you, as opposed to looking to them for making a meaning you already have. It seems like a different relationship to me, but it's hard to tell if you make the art or the art makes you, or the materials and the processes. Is that relationship is just can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's really interesting perspective that you have on it. It's a reflective process. I can't say that. I think when the work gets really good and is really interesting to me, I don't know what I was doing when I made it, in a sense. So it wasn't about me thinking, okay, I'm going to make a piece that talks, and I have worked this way, and there's nothing wrong with working this way. I'm going to make a piece that talks about my, sense of loss over something in my life, the death of a loved one, and make work about that. And I'll start out with that very clear intention, but then somewhere along the way, I move out of the way. Myself, my ego, my intention moves out of the way, and then the work kind of takes on a life of its own. And I've always found that the work that happens after I've let go of my intention is the most interesting, the most successful. And that's because, for me, it reflects something back to me that's new. It's a new discovery. It's new information about myself. It's something that I couldn't have set out to do, because I had no awareness that this was even what was happening for me. And I find that when I go back and look at older work sometimes now, I'll look at it and think, oh my God, that's what that was about. But at the time, I would have never told you, oh, this was about X, Y, and Z, because I really wasn't in tune with what it was about until much later. So it's part of the process of self-discovery, and it's a reflective relationship between the work and myself.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
I wanted to add a comment, but I'm up in Placitas and I just had a huge windstorm come through and knock over a bunch of things. I really enjoyed both of your works and talking about them, but I wanted to also say there was a strong clarity for me in both artists where the work I think could stand alone, and I could invent a story, you know, which is what the viewer does. But they were both very beautiful, both of you, the two artists. I think the work was very beautiful to see. And there was a wonderful, in the photographs, there was a luminosity that I really liked, where the light was kind of sneaking through. And in the collage work of the first artist, I'm sorry, I don't have your name in my head. There was also a wonderful light, but it was more a frontal light that I liked. So even though you're speaking a lot about the darkness, I was more attracted to the light. For me, the light was more hidden and then came through. But both, they were all very strong images, and thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And I think that's what makes the light is the dark, and the dark makes the light. I mean, we couldn't have one without the other. It's that razor's edge. You know, it's like one determines the other. So they coexist. They have to coexist. So, but thank you.
I was curious. Sorry. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have texture in your paper after you sand through and put it through the printer. Is there texture to the surface, or does it stay smooth with the next ink applying?
It's really interesting what happens to the surface. I told you that I experimented, excuse me, on different surfaces. I never use a canvas paper or paper that's textured like canvas, like some photographers have done. But I do have some luster paper that has a bit of a texture to it. Those did not work at all with this process. So the paper starts out matte, kind of the thickness of maybe a really nice piece of Arches cotton rag paper. And through the inking and the sanding, they become really smooth. It's really interesting. It's like buffing. It's almost like I've buffed the surface. So the surface feels like a newly polished pair of leather shoes. It's really interesting. You see the texture, but you can't feel it. It's kind of interesting.
So what kind of papers are you using?
They're cotton rag, but there are a variety of thicknesses. Some are thinner and some are thicker. Some have clay surface. Excuse me. The ones one picture that I showed you that had the white spots that I said were actually almost like little tears in the paper, that comes from a paper that has a clay covering on the top. It's for making photographs. It gives you a really nice surface for making that photographs because of that clay on the paper. But most of the paper that I use is just cotton rag.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
They're very beautiful.
Thanks. Thanks. I can't get away from that. That's one of the things that's also important to me. There has to be something beautiful in the image. And I know that beauty comes and goes in fashion in the art world, and it's not always on trend, but that is something that's always, I have to want to look at it. You know, even the darkest, deepest, most disturbing images, there has to be something in it that makes me want to look at it. So beauty is something that is important to me.
All right, anybody else?
I have another question. I have a question for you. I know you're tape recording these.
Yes.
So is there a way to go back and see last week's, and how do I do that?
Yes. It's on our Remarque YouTube channel.
Oh, okay.
And I meant to send a link, but I forgot. Here, I'll put it in the chat here in a minute. Let me get it up. So if nobody else has any questions, I want to say thank you so much to Meredith and Michelle.
Can I say something?
And
Could I say one thing? I just want to offer thanks to you and to both these artists for this really amazing, intense, and wonderful work. And thank you for hosting this.
well, thank you so much for participating. We're really delighted to have not only all of you here to watch the talks, but also the artists for participating in the show. And we hope to someday see you in Albuquerque.
That would be lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, let's hope.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.
It was really great. Yeah.
Thank you.